We are working on the Peekaboo back option for Thea. You're going to place your back pieces right sides together and you're going to stitch them together along the center seam. Then you're going to fold your back elastic in half to find the center and place a pin or a clip, and you're going to match that to the center back seam of the Peekaboo back. You'll be stitching the elastic to the back with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. I like to use my serger for this step, but you can also use a sewing machine. So I've got that center pin fixed, and then I have the curved edge of the Peekaboo back here, and I'm going to match the end of the Peekaboo back elastic to the end of the curved opening. And you're not gonna stretch for the first 1/2 inch or so, as I'm showing you here. You want to stitch 1 to 1 without stretching the elastic. So I've got that lined up perfectly with the raw edge, and I am going to secure it in place by hand turning the knob so that the needles are down into the elastic to hold it in place. Then I will stitch just the first 1/2 inch or so without stretching the elastic. When I get to this point, I'm going to make sure my needles are down into the elastic, and I'm just going to stitch to the center to start. So I'm pulling at that center pin so that the width of the elastic matches the back opening. And I'm going to make sure the elastic is lined up with the raw edges and just stitch little bit by little bit, readjusting the fabric as needed. You're going to have to stretch the elastic pretty much as it can possibly stretch. That's why a knit elastic is required here. Now, as I approach the center pin, I'm just going to start working a little bit slower. I'm going to stitch as far as I can to that center pin until the clip is in the way of the needle, and then I'm going to make sure I'm holding that stretch in place. You can see me holding that all the way, and now I've got my needle down in the center of the back. I'm going to move on to the other side. So again, I am stretching this elastic as much as it can stretch, and I'm just going to keep going down the side. You'll see as I reach the end how I finish this. And every time I stop to readjust, I'm making sure my needles are down. So I'm pulling the elastic as much as I can, stitching. Now, as I get close, I'm stretching the elastic so it's just past that raw edge, because remember, it's going to bounce back a little bit. So again, I'm stretching it just past that bottom raw edge. And now I'm to the point where you can see that the elastic is lined up perfectly with the raw edge. I'm going to finish that side without stretching as well. That was about a 1/2 inch or so. Okay, then you're going to turn the elastic so it's enclosed within the fabric. Make sure those raw edges are aligned, and you can clip it in place to hold it. And then when you top stitch, you are going to have to stretch the elastic as you stitch in place. Okay, we are working on the waistband ties now. I've folded them right sides together, and I'm going to make this scant 1/2 inch snip. I'm not measuring, but you should definitely measure. I've just done so many of these that I feel confident doing this. You're going to stitch right sides together with a 1/2 inch seam allowance along the majority of the waistband tie, along that top edge, and along the short side opposite the snip. So I like to start with the short edge, and you can see here I start to make a mistake, but I correct myself. It is a 1/2 inch seam allowance. So I stitch along the short edge first, and I will use some liquid stitch here to hold that one cut I made in place so the stitches don't unravel. And then I'm going to start working on the long edge. So again, it's a 1/2 inch seam allowance, and I'm stitching all the way to that snip I made earlier. So you can see as I get closer, I'm stitching still with a 1/2 inch seam allowance, and then I'm going to move the portion that I'm not stitching out of the way to be sure I don't catch it in my seam allowance. Then I'm going to grab my point and turn tool and turn this right side out. I love using this because it makes such nice, clean, sharp points. So I use the pointed edge on each side to get a nice, crisp finish. And I'll turn it all the way right side out. So this is the portion that'll get stitched to the Peekaboo back bodice. Okay, we're going to go ahead and do that now. So I'm going to pin the raw edges, the unfinished portion of the waistband tie, to the bottom raw edge of that Peekaboo back bodice. So I like to place one clip at the side seam, and then I go ahead and match the elastic portion of the Peekaboo back bodice to those raw edges at that snip we made. It should match up perfectly. So I pin both ends and then pin in the middle. And you will stitch this with a 1/2 inch seam allowance. I like to actually start at the elastic side of the Peekaboo back bodice and stitch to the side seam. That way I can make sure that these edges are perfectly aligned. So I'm holding that in place really well to make sure it's not shifting on me. Stitch all the way to the side seam. And that is the finished product. And then if you're using a serger, you're going to take your serger tail and fold it back along the seam allowance. And then you're going to finger press the seam allowance toward the bodice. And that encloses the serger tail right there, and you will secure it in place with a small bar tack stitch right there.